Welcome to Matthew, Lesson 2, Chapter 2. I titled it Adored and Opposed because Jesus was both. The Gospel of Matthew is the only gospel to include the story of the Magi. That might be good trivia if you're ever playing a Bible trivia game. Only the book of Matthew talks about the Magi. Well, why would a Jewish author of a gospel include the story of Gentile Persian kings in the story of Jesus? Originally, the Magi were conceived or perceived to be pagan Persian priests. They studied the stars, astronomy. They were Gentiles, and yet it says about the Magi, they sought the King of the Jews. History at this time was fascinating, and probably hidden in some of the unspoken is some real truth. How did they know to follow the Star of David, the Star of Christ? Why was it they were curious to seek after that star? Remember that when the Jewish nation crumbled, the north to the south, that the northern tribes were taken captive by Babylonia. Among them was Daniel, a brilliant young man who became quite used by the Persian government. Daniel found favor wherever he went. He lived a long life in captivity. During that time, it is believed that Daniel led many of them to faith in the one true God, that many of his captors became believers. The only book of the Bible that describes those who stayed behind in the region of Babylon or Assyria, that area is the book of Esther. Esther is the only book that tells us about the Jewish remnant that stayed behind in the region of Persia, even though most of them came back to Israel. Well, among those believers in that area were very likely these astrologers, scientists, who, if they were not people of faith, would have been at least people curious about the faith, curious about Daniel's faith. Daniel left a remnant of believers and those that were influenced by believers in the area of Persia. And that is probably where these Magi originated from. They came at a time when Herod the Great was the king there in Jerusalem and was leading in all manner. He had been king for a long time, but by this time he had aged and had become probably somewhat senile as well as angry, mean. And so when you hear about this story, you can understand why God would have directed Joseph as he did. This story of the Magi would not have been known or even discussed by many had it not been for the decision Herod the Great made. Only a few people knew what Herod had done, and all of them were Jewish. Because after the Magi left, Herod demanded the lives of all the babies 2 years and under. So the point of putting this story of the Magi in Matthew's gospel was that Jesus had come to change the way the Jewish people thought of their leaders. Herod the Great actually was of Jewish lineage, and yet he was fully Roman. He had been given that position because the Roman government thought he would be a better leader among the Jewish people. And it turned out he was actually quite cruel. His son followed suit. He had 2 sons, and both of them followed in his ways. So Matthew 2 begins with his gospel omitting many of the details of Christ's birth. That's why we almost always study the birth of Christ from the book of Luke. His book was written later, and he probably used direct testimony from John and possibly even Mary from when he went to visit in Ephesus. That's where John took Mary after the death of Christ. So that's why Luke's gospel is the best, most detailed story of Christ's birth. But even Luke did not include this story of the Magi. And so this has been an important book to the Jewish audience because he's going to talk about something that helped them understand how Jesus was their Messiah. Luke wrote mostly to Gentiles, and he did not include the story of the Magi. Every gospel is written with a certain purpose in mind and a certain audience. That's why there are differences in each gospel. So, I begin today's passage by saying that your nativity set you get out at Christmas is really inaccurate. Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. And behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." Now, one of the things you can know is if you have a nativity set, you probably have a camel, maybe 3. This would have been a large entourage of people that entered Jerusalem. They would have been dressed as foreigners. They would have been crowded with servants. They were kings, Persian kings. This would have been it would have caused quite a ruckus in the city of Jerusalem when they arrived. When Herod the king heard about their arrival, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. We miss that little phrase if we don't understand what Matthew is saying. All of Jerusalem would have been worried, because if Herod the king was troubled, it meant trouble to the Jewish people. And so Herod assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people. This would have been the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He assembled them together, all of them, and he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. This is the beginning, the note, that the first indicator to the Pharisees and Sadducees that something was going on. And they told the King Herod in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is written by the prophet, which, by the way, is one more fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. It is written, "And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." That was 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 to 2. It was widely known that that was a passage about the coming Messiah, who would be a shepherd like David, would be a Jewish man, but he would also be the Messiah. So Herod probably feared scaring the Holy Family. And so, because Bethlehem is a very, very small town, about 5.5, 6 miles outside of Jerusalem. David was from Bethlehem. The main industry there was shepherding, because that's where the sheep were raised that people purchased to take into Jerusalem on their way there, on their pilgrimages. And so a very large group of soldiers would have been a threat. Had Herod sent soldiers, he probably would have caused everyone in the city of Bethlehem to run. And he didn't want that to happen. So it says Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem. He sent these wise men, these Persian kings, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." The point was the secrecy and the deceit of Herod at this point proved that there were good people in this Christmas story and there were bad. But this is the heart of who the Magi are. After listening to the king, the one in authority over the entire area, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. Those words, the child, was not the Aramaic, not the word used for a baby, a newborn baby. It was instead the word used for a child of 2 or more, a toddler, usually somebody, not a newborn infant, but a child. And so when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. They're not at the cave where Jesus was born anymore. They have moved to a place in Bethlehem, to a home, and that's where Mary and Joseph are staying with their toddler. And again, we have the Jewish king against the Gentile Magi here. And going into the house, the Magi saw the child with Mary his mother and fell down and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Those are valuable, expensive items that only kings would have had in their possession. It was a rare spice used in burial, rare fragrances that they used in their homes and in their worship. The gifts that were offered to the young Christ child were expensive gifts. It's believed by most theologians that this is how Joseph was able to finance his trip and his time in Egypt when they had to flee there. Those items could have been sold in any market and exchanged for goods, food, housing, all of those things. It was essentially money for Joseph and Mary. And being warned in a dream, the Magi were warned in a dream not to return to Herod. They departed then to their own country by another way. And it says, now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt. There's a little phrase, by night, that we just read over and in our current days don't think that much of. Joseph didn't think about whether or not he should go to Egypt. He was asleep, he received a dream, and he immediately went, rose, took Mary and the baby Jesus, and they left at night, something no one did at this time. There weren't lights. There weren't roads illuminated. The fact that Joseph fled by night means he went immediately. He went even though it was dangerous to travel. It means he did not wait to do what God, the angel of God, had told him to do. And that's a real significant part of this Christmas story. And Joseph departed to Egypt, not a place where a Jewish man would take his family. And he remained there until the death of Herod the Great, the current Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. His trip to Egypt fulfilled yet another Old Testament prophecy. Verse 16 says, then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in that region who were 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Herod was back in Bethlehem waiting for the wise men to return. When they did not, and he probably did not wait long, he immediately sent his soldiers and he killed all of the children in Bethlehem, all of the boys in Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, probably because the wise men had been on their journey for almost 2 years. That's why we believe the Christ child was about 2 years old when the Magi came and finally found him. And that fulfilled a prophecy from the prophet Jeremiah that said, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. That was from the prophet Jeremiah about the region of Ramah, which was the region of Bethlehem. And Rachel in the lineage of King David. Now, we are more horrified by those verses than we can imagine. But understand, this was not a well-known act of King Herod outside the Jewish faith. There were probably less than 10 2-year-olds in Bethlehem. It was a very small city with only a few families. Estimates are 10 to 20 at the most. Young boys that were killed, but even one was horrific. But not something that would have made national or Roman news. Something that absolutely would have been known by the people who had grown up Jewish. And that's why Matthew reminds them that even that horrible time indicated that this child was the Messiah. Verse 19, but when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. Interestingly, he did not go back to where he had come from. Instead, he withdrew to an area of Galilee. So if you go to verse 22, it says, but when he heard that Archelaus, who was one of the sons of Herod the Great, was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth. Why does that matter? Because what was spoken by the prophets was fulfilled, that he, the Messiah, would be called a Nazarene. So Matthew gives us so much information in the story of the Magi, but he included it especially for his Jewish readers because he needed yet again another opportunity to show how Jesus had fulfilled significant Old Testament messianic prophecy. It also shows the unique connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the New Covenant. Matthew is showing the unfolding of God's miraculous care of the Jewish people throughout history, because he was going to use them to bring his son into the world. But it was also to say that the Jewish leaders had often been in opposition and had often worked on the opposing side of God's plan. All throughout his gospel, Matthew prepares his Jewish readers to recognize that the Pharisees and the Sadducees got it wrong. God had always provided for his children, and his provision has no boundaries except those we, his children, build up. The story of the Magi is a picture of God's perfection, to know and to provide for our futures, just as he sustained and protected and kept the life of his son and Mary and Joseph safe, so he can work in our lives to do the same. God loves us, and he wants to bless us and provide for our futures as well. Charles Spurgeon is a great theologian, and he said, God will never cease to help until we cease to need. How much do you need Jesus Christ today? The more you need the Lord, the more you will seek God's help. I'll see you next time.